Star Citizen Shorts, Episode 2, 8 Steps. Matchstick, this is White Rook. Come in, Matchstick. The droning communique ceaselessly beat upon Ed's ears. He was being called. White Rook was calling him again. He groaned in his bed and turned over, peeking at his clock. Well past 11 hours had flown by since he had climbed into his bunk. It felt like 2. 1 maybe. He sighed aloud, the droning call hammering his head and compounding his hangover. "All right, Selina, all right," he began, as he held back anything else after the effort made his head swirl. "I swear you have the message recorded, don't you?" he asked, not expecting the microphone in his disregarded yellow Baylor helm to pick it up from off the floor. But it did. "Ed, I'm White Rook," came a quick reply. "We have to start using call signs," demanded the disembodied voice with its small, tinny sound emanating from the helmet. "Ed? Ed?" repeated Selina more loudly. Then seconds later, in a completely different tone, came the follow-up. "Matchstick, this is White Rook. Come in, Matchstick." Ed swore. It was a pre-recorded message. His head still ached, but he had slammed back some pills to take the edge off of it. He was now looking over his side taser and its attachments as he sat in the turret seat of his Cutlass Blue. He used the taser often in his line of work and found the maintenance of it, along with his other weapons, to drown out the pounding in his ears. The turret seat in which he sat seemed to be the most comfortable one in the ship. It was nearby the rack from which he had pulled the taser off, yet truthfully, he told himself, he was just being lazy. Or maybe he was just avoiding comms. Pausing with a sidelong look at his helmet, he picked it up and placed it on his head. He clicked over the channel which Selina was no doubt still SOSing him on. "Yeah, Selina, it's me. You can turn that thing off," he said wearily. The message went dead in mid-call. "Unknown call sign, this is White Rook. Repeat, unknown call sign," came the only reply. "Selina, you don't say repeat over comms. You say again," he explained. "Oh, now you care about comm etiquette, huh, Mr. Ex-Military? No need if you aren't going to take the whole thing seriously," she replied. "Right, fine, White Rook," he said, feeling as though he had balls of cotton in his mouth. "This is White Rook. Come in, Matchstick," said Selina. Ed closed his eyes, both against the frustration and the dazzling glare of the sun outside the canopy as he approached the pilot's seat. He held up a hand and tried to block out the sun. "Come in, Matchstick," she said again. Ed could hear a subtle note of petition in the voice this time. He sighed. "White Rook," said Ed, as he booted up the main drives and power on his Cutlass Blue. His pilot's chair ascended mechanically within the dual-position cockpit. "This is Matchstick." His voice was resigned, but stronger, having shaken off the anger and frustration of reality which he always felt after waking up. "Go ahead." "This is White Rook," came Selina's voice, a voice which barely contained the enthusiasm it held. "I need a rendezvous as soon as possible. I have something." After a brief pause, she added, "Over." Ed put a fist to his mouth and inhaled. He started to use the name Selina, but bit it off and spoke through clenched teeth. "White Rook, you had better have something for me, else I'm gonna kill you for waking me up." "Matchstick, this is White Rook," she went on, ignoring his jab. "I do have something. You had better get over here or we'll miss it. Over." "Pronto," she added. Then, "Over." "I'm on my way, White Rook. I'll be at Everest Harbor in less than 10 minutes. It was a long 10 minutes for Ed. Selina was beside herself at the fact that Ed had stated his destination. There followed a long, though technically correct, exposition of the reasons why they needed to use call signs and code words. They played chess with each other as he journeyed towards her. Over the game, she explained that anyone could be listening to them, a fact that Ed highly doubted, though it was possible. He clicked off the losing chess match, aware that he had lost in about 3 moves, as the ship started to decelerate out of Quantum near Everest Harbor. Once free of Quantum, Ed set course, a few points off the center of the station. Pushing for full throttle, Ed powered up his afterburners, increasing his speed to maximum within seconds of coming out of the jump. A moment after reaching full burn, his onboard computers began blaring out warnings of overheating engines. His caution was due to actually having cargo that other people would take chances to get back, and he sighed loudly when he conceded that minor point to Selina. He paused the afterburners after they had cooled somewhat. The hated feeling of being exposed close to a port like he was, but outside its protective sphere of weapons, really did hammer home the 10-minute lesson he had been subjected to. He silently agreed to give in to some of her demands, at least when his cargo bay was weighed down like it was. Minutes later, Ed touched down inside the hangar at the port. His onboard systems relayed a successful landing to him. He called the hangar control team and requested a top-up of both quant and hydrogen fuel. He paid the fee without looking at the cost, then tapped the exit seat controls and receded back into the ship, heading aft. The first door slid open, and he quickly looked over the cold storage cargo as he passed by. A half-dozen pods with wanted criminals within them hung motionless at hand. He didn't bother to check their life signs. They should all be fine, and if they weren't, he'd settle for half their bounty. Aside from the lower cost of delivering a cold body over a warm one, the thought of the lives inside didn't weigh on him for a moment. He couldn't help if there were malfunctions within his equipment which might prevent their safe collection, so he didn't think about it. Instead, he lived by the adage that you could only control what you could control. The rest would sort itself out without you, no matter what. Pausing at the compartment door as he moved through his ship, the side effects of the headache were starting to come back. It might have been the bright lights of the cargo bay, but probably not the hangover this time. Well, not just the hangover. The pills he had taken were pretty good for that. What he needed was a coffee. He clicked the cargo bay controls, and the rear ramp slowly swung down. He leaned against the frame, waiting for the ramp to descend. Outside was, of course, Selina. How she knew what hangar he was arriving at never seemed to matter. She was never late to the rendezvous. "Howdy," she said, as she tipped her head and leaned sideways. Her jet-black hair was tied back and flowed out behind her as she did so. She shrugged and adjusted the clumsy, oversized, extreme cold winter jacket which she was wearing as a cape of sorts. It was wide open at the front, making her short frame look bulky. The jacket was a gift, or heirloom, which she carried around from her days back on Microtech. Ed had the foresight not to ask why. She was smiling in her characteristic way, and it was a smile which warned off ill moods. Ed knew it was only half a mask, yet it still managed to melt through his carefully nursed annoyance. "Out of yourself," he responded, though not unkindly. Holding up a hand, he descended the ramp and tried to forestall any further exchange as he continued, "I need a coffee first. First thing." Her left hand materialized from under the jacket. In it was a coffee, a large coffee. She held it up to her nose as she sniffed it in mock exaggeration, wrinkling her nose as the steam rose up out of the cup. "4 of both?" she exclaimed, then grimaced. "To how you stay fit with all the fat in there." "Thanks," drawled Ed, accepting the coffee. "But I know you sneak in some of these. It's showing," he jabbed, though in deadpan jest. "I'm gonna need—" he continued, but was cut short as Selina flourished with yet a second coffee in her other hand. He had been about to head for the lift, but was stopped short at the sight of it. "This one's almost cold," she stated. "By the time you're done with this, the one I just gave you will be lukewarm, and you'll be able to drink it too, just the way you like it." She smiled, a knowing smile, a checkmate smile. "And I think I look just fine, thank you," she added. Ed returned a smile in similar fashion. Both hands now tied down with coffee cups, she gave him a left fist in the ribs. He didn't really feel it, and he wasn't supposed to. "Now here are the cords," she said, slipping a data stick into his chest pouch as the same moment which brought forth the fist. "We don't have a lot of time, you know. This one is practically begging to get picked up. Actually, he is begging to get picked up. Claims he got stuck out on Comare ST1-92. "Stuck?" Ed responded dubiously. He took a gulp of the second coffee. It really was perfectly lukewarm. "Yeah, I was listening to the whole thing live about a half hour ago. See, apparently he went in with a little Pisces and landed behind the remote turrets." She smiled innocently as she began to steer him back towards the ship ramp. She was tactful, but not cautious in pretending she wasn't hurrying him along. When he did whatever he was doing there and tried to take off, well, the Pisces wouldn't budge. He must have taken damage from the turrets on the approach, so he's good and stuck. "Trespassing?" asked Ed. "Trespassing is hardly a big bounty, Selina." "Ah," she exclaimed. "This isn't some sightseer who jumped into a restricted area. He is using the broadcoms to avoid looking suspicious. The UEE would be all over him if they knew who he was. He's pretending to be a dullard to get a ride out of there from some idiot." "And you know this how?" asked Ed as he nursed his coffee. The look Selina gave him dripped with annoyance. She began working her fingers along the SAS which wore over her midsection and left shoulder. Ed knew it had keys and controls embedded within the material and electronically linked to her setup, which was located elsewhere. Her eyes darted around at information Ed could not see, which was displayed upon her oversized glasses, deep purple in hue. She flashed him conversation logs from around the same time he had begun her hailing assault to wake him up. The name and ID which were displayed were then again shown over a separate time and date, this time around several weeks prior. Ed remembered the date. A pleasure yacht had been attacked and an apparent shipjacking gone wrong. Whatever the original goal had been, all the passengers and shipjackers alike had been killed. The passengers by the shipjackers, and the shipjackers by a trigger-finger mercenary force paid to clear them out. It wasn't clear who was responsible for the operation, as all the witnesses were dead, but the logs here indicated that at least one had survived, the clear link, it seemed. Just before the 890 jump yacht had been boarded, an Anvil Pisces, registration of the same, the one which had landed at the local commeray, had been logged as requesting assistance by the hapless pleasure yacht. The 890 jump had been responding to the plea just before the crew had been massacred by pirate boarding parties. An ancient trick, but a daring one in the orbit of Hurston itself. No wonder they had all died. "Well, this is no trespasser," said Ed. "Glad I could spell it out for you, Matchstick," said Selina. "Where did you get this?" asked Ed. Exclaimed Selina. "As though you'd understand." "Okay, maybe not," conceded Ed. "But it clearly didn't come from the 890 jump. Their data suites have been purged by the shipjackers. Otherwise the mercs would have tracked this guy down by now." "Uh-huh," said Selina. "I'm impressed. You really could be an info chant, Ed. You'd figure that out quick." Ed didn't respond. He wasn't thinking about the insult. It was low-hanging fruit, common banter from Selina besides. "Wait a second. Have you been tracking this guy since the hijacking?" he said in astonishment. Selina raised her eyebrows, then grinned and looked around conspiratorially. "Now you see why I want to meet in person all the time. If anyone watches as closely as I do, they would notice if you only responded in person to the big deals. We have to keep this kind of stuff off the records. It was super easy to get this and piece it together. Who knows who else has picked it up by now?" Ed highly doubted how easily the information had been teased out. It would have taken close observation of the shipjacking, as well as the local channels, and with a keen eye over the last few weeks. The guy was a cool customer to operate so openly, he thought, hiding in plain sight, and almost nobody outside of nobody looked under their noses for that kind of thing. He sized up Selina while thinking. He had known she was good. This, however, was pretty good. Still, she was correct. The authorities would be skimming suspicious persons, and bounty hunters really only followed known leads. This was something else. Though technically the pilot of the Pisces hadn't officially done anything illegal during the hijacking, the UEE would certainly want to have a chat with him, or more profitably, Hurston Security itself. He whistled, and she smiled genuinely at his subtle praise. All right, he said soothingly, then added, "White Rook." "I practically love you," she said, and had him nearly jogging up the ramp a few seconds later. Ed punched the data inputs of his new heading. He held the destination in the ship's crosshairs as the navicomputer did its number crunching. Within seconds, his drive was spooled and ready. He entered the quantum field as his ship was pulled through space at superluminal speeds. The distortion was disconcerting to people unfamiliar with the sensation. Not so to Ed. He had spent more of his life in space and on stations than ever on a planet. The familiar sights and sounds of quantum travel were as to him as clouds and the rustle of wind to terrestrials. He reflected upon the upcoming mission. It would not be too difficult. The commeray had sentry guns, but they would not bother him. He held bounty hunting certifications for local space and beyond in several other solar systems. His target had no ship, and he was afforded the protection of the same automated defenses should anyone drop in from behind. There was no need to be worried. Which, of course, worried Ed. He always approached the job as though it may be his last. With time to spare before he arrived, Ed dreamt up scenarios in which things could go wrong as his ship drifted through the magenta-colored field beyond his ship's quantum bubble. He held Selina, and they began another round of chess. "Garnet Richard, I'm here to give you a ride," said Ed as he spoke into his comm unit. His ship was hovering over a landing platform just off the edge. On the platform itself was the smaller Pisces which Selina had sent him to. The Pisces was lit with an intense beam of light coming from Ed's ship. Beyond was the station itself, a labyrinth of corridors and airlocks, and completely automated. Ed hoped he wouldn't have to go inside and fetch this guy. That would only be the case if he made a run for it. Ed would not use his onboard weapon systems to pulverize Garnet to dust. He needed this guy alive. Otherwise, it was just a minor bounty, hardly worth the fuel. I spoke with you about the quick pickup fee. This is Ed Becker. Where are you, man? Ed, I didn't expect you in the Cutlass Blue. That is a ship of bounty hunters. I've got a C2 crime stat, man. Kinda makes me nervous, you know, responded Garnet. I said I was in a cuddy. I should have said which variant of the Cutlass to make you less nervous. Sorry about that. Ed nodded to himself. Garnet was no fool, but he was playing one now. This type of bounty was very dangerous. It was almost always a battle of wits with his quarry, tracking, chasing, cat and mouse. Whether it was in space, a dogfight, or this, the stakes were high, and no doubt Garnet had plans for Ed's ship beyond a mere ride. Right, responded Garnet. Well, do me a favor and spin the cuddy around. I don't like being right under someone's guns, especially someone I just met. I'll meet you on the edge of the pad. Just lower the ramp and I'll suit out to you. You understand, eh? The last statement had been said oh so innocently. Ed smiled at the would-be subtlety of the obvious ploy. Garnet was playing the game well. The pretend exchange over comms while Ed had maneuvered in were the opening moves. Very straightforward, neither side deviating from established strategies, both concealing their true motives while neither tipped their hand that they were in fact already planning the endgame. The farce exchange had guaranteed passage aboard Ed's ship for Garnet. In exchange for a modest transportation fee, Ed would ferret Garnet to a port of his choosing, and so the pawns moved. Ed's first strategy had been to leverage his firepower over Garnet, but that development had just been thwarted. Knight takes pawn. All right, Garnet, replied Ed, allowing a slight chuckle into his voice. I do understand. Would you do the same courtesy, though? I'd like to see you lower your hatch and show me that you don't have any weapons on your person, before you board. It was a reasonable, even necessary request, and Garnet agreed in turn and lowered his hatch, showing an empty hold with his palms up, the universal sign of surrender, developing his position. All right, now spin around and I'll come out, requested Garnet. Like I said, I feel pretty naked out here. The last statement had been another play-acting routine, and Ed knew it. Inside the cargo hold, Garnet was still within the sphere of the Pisces shields, which were still up. It'd be safe from any energy weapons, at least for a short time. Maybe enough to make a break for it into the facility itself. It was still a risk, and Ed admired it. Unless Garnet had very good sight recognition of ship weapon systems, there was no way for him to know the loadout that was on the cuddy. A bold move. Check. Ed waved a hand in half salute as he slowly maneuvered the Cutlass about 180 degrees. He did so with a sort of practiced sloppiness, taking about 10 years of experience out of his control inputs, which he thought looked natural. He slightly overshot the turn and made a minor correction to ease his momentum, a positional strategy. All right, that's good. I'm coming to you now, stated Garnet. Lower the ramp, and I'll touch down soon. Ed followed the instructions. The ramp lowered. Inside the cargo bay was empty, the lights dimmed by apparent malfunction due to disrepair. Garnet hesitated upon seeing this, but as the ramp was almost as wide as the bay itself, there were no hiding places inside. At the back of the bay was the secured door to the room which held the prisoner pods. Ed idly wondered what sort of devices Garnet had brought with him in order to penetrate further into the ship. He was going to try to catch Ed napping, a dynamic gambit. Hey, Ed, I don't mind roughing it back here, Garnet said. The cargo bay has more than enough space for me to kick my feet up, of course, but there's no bunks back here. I'll pay extra if you have a hammock I can rig up. The plea for bunk space was nothing than an old ploy. So much that Ed saw through it right away. He opens the interceding door to hand over some kind of cot, and Garnet springs his trap. It was so obvious, in fact, that Ed knew it was a smokescreen. Furthermore, he was supposed to realize this. Thus, it was meant to ensure that Ed did not approach the door. In turn, Ed knew Garnet would be standing at it, attempting to bypass it at this exact second. Garnet's pieces were falling directly into place. This was his endgame. Yet it was for this reason which Ed did not need to hesitate in taking aim with his Castak Arms Devastator shotgun. He simply opened fire at the base of the door as soon as he had maneuvered himself into the ship from the rear ramp. Touching down on the artificial gravity within the Cutlass, the shotgun lived up to its namesake. Ed watched Garnett slammed against the wall as the blast impacted him from behind. The shot pierced the protective space in several places. Air leaks erupted all across the suit as it decompressed. Blood followed. Several pellets had scratched the surface of the hidden SMG safely taped to Garnett's back for use which would now not come. The second shot was a much closer range, and it tore through Garnett's right leg as he fell onto his back. The blast spun Garnett midair, despite the artificial gravity of the deck. Ed discarded the shotgun and pulled out his trusty taser. He aimed at Garnett's chest and noticed the horrified look of shock through the tinted helmet. He fired before Garnett could even manage a single word, his entire ambush having only taken seconds. Checkmate. Nearly 10 minutes had passed since Ed had administered the basic first aid necessary to ensure his bounty's life would not bleed out all over the cargo bay. This was eased by the stasis pods which the ship carried. It allowed Ed to place the man and his detached leg in a field which rendered the body immune to further physical damage. He would need extensive care in order to survive his collection, but that was not Ed's problem, nor would he provide such care pro bono. That could be acquired at whichever facility paid the highest for his bounty, or not, depending on the mood towards him. Whatever the case may be, Ed decided to hurry. He did not want to get caught drifting at the edge of a landing pad with such a potentially high-value target in his hold, let alone his other iced bounties. He tapped the key pass on the door. He reneged his passcode with an audible beep. He looked down. Garnett had been quick. Attached to the key door was an electronic lockbreaker, a highly illegal piece of gear. It was still cycling through the untold number of combinations which would open the door. Ed, annoyed, moved to the rear of the ramp, following the same path he had taken to avoid a direct assault on Garnett. He collected the SMG which Garnett had delivered to him, as well as his own shotgun. Then he jumped outside the rear of the ship and used his suit to jet around to the port airlock. It had been left ajar in order to avoid the vibration or the sound of the closing door tipping off Garnett to the strategy of Ed's plan. It was highly unlikely that the subtle vibration and sound from within the ship's airlock would have been felt or heard by Garnett, but Ed's motto of "control what you can" held true. He entered the ship and secured the airlock, moving to his left through the other secure door and into the bunk area, which shared the same open space as the cockpit and arms locker. He placed both weapons in the gun rack, along with his taser. Then took a seat in the pilot's chair and rode it up about a meter into the cockpit. Immediately he began a series of accelerating maneuvers designed to avoid a tail and easily achieve full speed, after which he checked his blind spots. Neither his eyes nor his scanners picked up another ship besides the Pisces which had been left on the pad. Ed used his momentary safe position to plot a course to an inconvenient jump point. He then spooled up his drives and positioned his ship to take him through a series of complicated jumps. This process did not seem necessary, as nobody was apparently following him, nor observing in any way, which to Ed made it all the more necessary. He used the tedium between jump points to call an old friend, a mechanic turned salvager. He was unavailable, so Ed left him a message. "Tyler, it's Ed. Got a prize for you at ST-1-92. An Anvil Pisces sitting on a pad. Has some engine damage, but the shields and power seem okay." Ed didn't warn Tyler against the automated defenses. Tyler knew his business, and it would irk him to be told how to retrieve his ship. "I have the owner secured. Should be an easy score legally. Ed out." After setting his destination to Hurston itself, Ed relaxed and headed aft to retrieve his cargo. Garnett's pod was simple to move back into its stored position within the central compartment of the ship. He retrieved the lockbreaker. It would be handy at some point. Then he logged into his mainframe to enter Garnett's name into the list of current bounty cargo. Clicking through the roll call, he idly called out the names of his bounties, remembering their fates. Harley Kane, fraud, tax evasion. A difficult job to track down. Not too hard to bag once confronted, though. Aaron Larson, drug dealer. Pretty free with their pistol, but folded like a chair when fired at. Forrest Shields. Aggravated assault. A host of other minors. That had been a pretty good brawl, though not with guns. Ed had shared a drink with him before tucking him into cold storage, and he had actually enjoyed talking to the guy. Tem Rowe. Ship theft out of the port on ArcCorp. Presumed dead long ago, his stolen Aurora long since given up. Selena had picked up a distress signal from him. Ed had barely made it to him before the guy's oxygen had expired through a broken mask. An easy bounty, not even conscious when Ed had arrived. Ed found the place for Garnett's name in the list, then entered the bounty and logged out of the console. He looked over the stasis pods with mild satisfaction. Overall, it was a pretty good haul. End of Episode 2. 8 Steps.